The pit was 3 meters deep. Drava knew the exact depth because she had measured it the only way available to her, by the length of her own body pressed against the earthen wall, by the reach of her arms above her head in the dark, by the sky reduced to a rectangle of fading light too far above to touch. She had made that calculation on the first night, methodically, the way her mother had taught her to assess any situation before allowing herself to feel it. She had been in the pit for more than a day. Bram was asleep against her chest. His breathing was shallow, not from injury but from dehydration and the bone-deep cold that settled into desert earth after midnight. She kept one hand pressed flat against his back, feeling the rise and fall of it, counting the rhythm the way she used to count stars through the smoke hole of the clan tent when he was still small enough to carry in one arm. He was still small enough to carry in one arm. He was 4 years old. Drava did not allow herself to think about how long they could survive at the bottom of the pit. She was an orc. She had survived things that should have killed her before. What she allowed herself to think about instead was the texture of the silence above her. Whether it carried the sound of wind only or something else, it carried something else. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who knew this land well enough not to rush across it. They came from the east, moved along what she estimated was the field boundary, stopped. She heard the dry creak of branches. A pause, then, directly above, a shadow crossed the rectangle of sky, a man's silhouette, the wide brim of a hat, the shape of broad shoulders against the pale morning light. Drava did not move. She pressed Bram closer and turned her face upward and waited. She had learned to read humans at a distance, the way the clan had taught all its scouts. You read the shoulders first. Tense shoulders meant fear, and fear made humans unpredictable, dangerous in the way of creatures who act before they think. This man's shoulders were not tense. They were heavy, the heaviness of someone carrying something that had nothing to do with the present moment, something old and interior and persistent. He looked down at her for a long time. She looked back. His hand moved to his side, to the revolver at his hip, and her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only concession to fear she permitted herself. Not for her own sake, for Bram's. But then the hand dropped, and the silhouette turned and walked away. The footsteps receded toward the east. Drava exhaled once, slowly, and did not move. She had survived the first assessment. She did not know what came next. She could not know what came next. She had stopped being able to predict what humans would do 3 weeks ago, when she had walked away from everything she had ever known and discovered that the world beyond the Stonefang clan was wider and stranger and more silent than she had imagined it would be. The footsteps returned. He came back faster than she expected. Not running, that same deliberate, ground-covering pace, but with purpose now, a different weight of intention. She heard something heavy dragged across the dry earth above. Then the rope came over the edge, thick and coiled, smelling of barn and old work, and it uncoiled as it fell, and the end of it landed in the dark earth beside her with a soft thud. She looked at the rope. She looked up at the man. He was leaning over the edge now, his face visible. Dark hair shot through with white, a jaw that had not been shaved in several days, eyes that were dark and carried something she recognized without being able to name. He said nothing. He only looked at Bram, still sleeping against her chest, and gave a single nod. Him first. Drava understood. She did not waste time on hesitation that had no productive function. She gathered her son carefully, waking him with the movement. He made a low, questioning sound, green eyelids fluttering. And she looped the rope under his small arms, securing it the way she had secured supply loads on mountain crossings, checked the knot twice, and pressed her forehead against his cheek for one moment. She said nothing. Some things did not have words, or rather, the words existed but were too large for the moment and would only make it heavier than it needed to be. The man pulled Bram up slowly, steadily. The boy swayed gently at the end of the rope as he rose, eyes open now, watching the earthen walls pass. And when he reached the edge, Drava heard the low scrape of the man catching him and setting him down on solid ground. She heard Bram make a small sound. She heard the man's voice, quiet and even, saying something she could not make out, not to her, to the boy. Then the rope came back down. She took longer than she wanted to. Her arms had less strength than she had calculated they would. The wall was dry and gave no purchase, and her hands kept slipping on the rope, despite the grip she knew how to apply, and there were several moments on the way up when the rational part of her mind registered the information without alarm. She was weaker than she had realized. The day and a half without water had cost more than she had accounted for, and the less rational part of her mind, the part she kept very quiet and very still in circumstances like these, understood that if she fell, she would not be able to get up again. She did not fall. The man pulled steadily from above, and she climbed, and when she reached the edge, she fell to her knees in the dry red earth and stayed there for a moment with her forehead nearly touching the ground, just breathing. The air up here tasted different, open, infinite. She pushed herself up, crawled to where Bram was sitting in the dirt with his legs tucked under him, watching her with those enormous dark eyes, and she folded him into her arms and held him, and felt his small hands grip the back of her vest. Neither of them spoke. The man stood a few feet away, not intruding, not retreating, just present in the way that certain people know how to be present, without demand, without urgency, without the human need to fill silence with noise. He said, low and even, "My farm is just over there. Come." Drava stood. She looked at him, really looked at him, the full assessment she had not been able to make from the bottom of the pit. 40-some years, strong still, built by physical work rather than by youth. The dark eyes she had registered from below carried something settled, like stone that has been in the same place long enough to have moss grow on it. He was not afraid of her. He was also not performing the absence of fear, which was the more common human response to orcs and the easier one to read. He simply regarded her with the same steadiness he had used to pull the rope. She picked up Bram, adjusted him against her hip, and followed. The farm appeared gradually as they came through the low scrub of twisted desert shrubs. First the glint of a windmill, then the shape of a barn, then the clay-walled house with its small windows and its wide porch and its yard where a dozen chickens moved in the loose, undirected way of creatures with no concerns. A well, a fence in need of repair on the eastern side, garden beds that had been recently turned. Everything here had been built by hand. She could tell by the character of it, not the roughness, but the precision that comes from someone who builds slowly and builds things to last rather than to look finished. A woman appeared on the porch. She had a broom in her hands and she stopped sweeping and stood very still when she saw them come through the scrub line. She was around the same age as the man, with light hair and a face that showed nothing yet. Not hostility, not welcome, not alarm. Just the focused, measuring stillness of someone deciding what they are looking at before they respond to it. The man climbed the porch steps and said without preamble, "They were in the south pit. They need water and food." The woman looked at Drava. She looked at Bram. She looked at the man. Then she went inside. She came back with a tin cup of water, then a second one, then a wooden bowl with dried meat and flatbread, and she set them on the porch bench without ceremony, as if feeding strangers who had appeared from desert pits was an unremarkable event in the routine of the day. Drava sat on the bench. Bram climbed into her lap and drank from the cup she held for him. She drank her own water slowly, eyes closed, and let the moment settle into her. The sensation of the physical crisis ending, the body's quiet, exhausted relief, the way ordinary things like water and shade and flat ground become extraordinary when you have been without them long enough. The man stood in the yard, hat in his hand, watching nothing in particular. The woman stood in the doorway, watching everything. His name was Aldrich Horn. She learned that by the end of the first day, when the sun had crossed the sky and begun its long descent toward the canyon ridges to the west, and Bram had fallen asleep in the corner of the kitchen on a folded blanket that the woman, Calla, Aldrich's wife, had placed there with a quiet economy of movement that she applied to everything. Drava said her name and her son's name. She said they had been in the pit for more than a day. She said she had come from the north, through the Badlands above the Green Shadow Canyon. She said she had been walking for 3 weeks. Aldrich leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and listened without interrupting. Calla sat across the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold sometime during the conversation and did not seem to notice. Drava said she had left the Stone Fang clan 23 days ago. She had left because she had refused a direct order from Ugar, the clan's leader. Ugar had called the warriors together and announced a raid on a human settlement 2 days' walk to the south. A small place, farmers and cattle ranchers. Few men capable of defending it. He had wanted the land and the grain reserves and the livestock. Burn everything else, he had said. Leave nothing that would need to be cared for. Drava had stood and said no. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the desert wind moved through the scrub with a sound like dry paper. Kala asked neutrally, "Why?" Drava looked at the table. "There were children in that settlement," she said. "I had passed through weeks before, looking for water. I saw them in the yard. They were small." She paused. "Like Bram." No one said anything. Igor had given her 3 days to leave with the boy. If she stayed, the punishment would extend to both of them. She left with what she could carry, which was not much, and she walked north through the Badlands and the high canyon country, following water sources when she could find them, rationing food, keeping to routes that avoided the Stonefang's patrol ranges. 3 weeks of that. The last several days had been the hardest. "Thank you," Kala said eventually, and it took Drava a moment to understand that the woman was thanking her for telling the truth, not for anything else, and that the offer of the room at the back of the house that came shortly afterward was connected to that same economy of respect. No ceremony, no explanation, just the thing itself. She slept with Bram in the back room that night, the first enclosed, sheltered sleep she had allowed herself since leaving the clan. She lay on her back on the narrow bed with Bram curled against her side and listened to the sound of the desert through the small window. Wind, the distant call of something nocturnal, the creak of the windmill turning, and she allowed herself, carefully and with full awareness of what she was doing, to feel the weight of having reached somewhere. Not somewhere safe. She knew better than to use that word about any place. Somewhere. A coordinate on the long map of where she and Bram had been and where they were going. A place with a roof and water and two people who had, so far, asked nothing that she could not give. It was enough for one night. In the days that followed, Bram recovered quickly in the way that young children do. Without drama, without gradual stages of improvement, simply waking on the second morning with bright eyes and an appetite that alarmed Drava with his normalcy. And by the second afternoon, he had discovered the chickens. Drava watched from the porch as he chased them across the yard with his arms outstretched, his green skin catching the afternoon light, his pointed ears moving with each burst of surprised laughter when they scattered away from him. He had always been like this, even during the worst days of the walk, when food was scarce and the nights were cold and Drava's own resolve had worn thin in places she preferred not to examine. Even then, Bram had found things to notice. Tracks in the dust, beetles under rocks, the color of sunset over Red Canyon walls. Aldrich was repairing the eastern fence when the laughter reached him. Drava saw him stop working. He stood with the tool in his hand and watched the boy run between the cackling chickens, and something moved across his face that she could not fully read. Not quite pain, not quite its opposite, something that lived in the territory between the two and had no clean name. He was not a man who showed things easily. She had understood that within the first few hours. But the things that crossed his face when he did not know he was being observed were different from the things he chose to present, and Drava had always been more interested in the former. On the fifth morning, she rose before the sun and went to the field. The hoe was leaning against the side of the barn where it had been left. She took it without asking. She found the rows where weeds had come in along the eastern edge of the wheat planting, fast-growing things with shallow roots, the kind that required only neglect to establish themselves. And she began working them out with the steady, rhythmic strokes she had learned from watching the clan tend its seasonal gardens in the high country. Aldrich found her there in the late afternoon. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She kept the rhythm of the hoe. "I know." He stood for a moment, then walked to where a second hoe leaned further down the row and picked it up. He worked the next section in the same silence she had established, and they continued that way until the light dropped and the heat went out of the day and the first stars appeared in the enormous desert sky above them. They walked back to the farm without speaking. But something in that silence was different from the silences of the first few days. Not the careful, measuring quiet of two parties, deciding whether they were threats to each other, but something that had passed through that stage and come out the other side into something that had no name yet, but was beginning to have a shape. It was on the evening of the fourth day, the day after the fieldwork, that Drava told them the part she had not yet told. She had been waiting for the right moment in the way that she waited for most things, without impatience, but with attention, watching for the conditions that made it possible. Those conditions were both Aldrich and Calla at the table, Bram asleep in the back room, the day's work done, the quiet that settles when people have been in the same space long enough to stop being strangers without yet being whatever came next. She said, "I need to tell you something true." Calla set down her coffee mug. Aldrich looked up from the harness he had been mending. Drava said she had not fallen into the pit by accident. Not entirely. She had found the farm before the farm found her, or more precisely, she had found it in the old-fashioned way, the way the Stone Fang Scouts had always operated, by listening to what was said about a place before going to it. In Ashrock, the small town to the north that she had skirted 3 weeks ago, careful to remain at the edge of the market, hooded, speaking to no one directly but listening to everyone, she had heard a particular story. A farmer south of town, the story went, had once found a man collapsed at his fence line and brought him inside rather than leaving him for the heat. The farmer did not ask where the man had come from or what he had done. He had given him water and let him rest and pointed him toward the road when he was well enough to travel. That story was 2 years old. But stories like that did not become untrue with time. They became more true in the way that things worth saying tend to accumulate rather than diminish. She had come to the farm on purpose. She had observed it for 3 days from the scrub line, watching Aldrich's routines, confirming what the story had suggested about his character. She had been preparing to approach when the exhaustion of 3 weeks' travel and a body running on too little water finally caught up with her in the dark, and she had stepped wrong on the covered edge of the pit and fallen. She had chosen this place, and then she had fallen into it anyway, which she had come to understand was the desert's sense of humor about careful plans. The silence that followed was different from the others. Aldrich looked at her steadily. Calla's hands had stilled entirely on the table. Drava said, "I understand if that changes what this is." Aldrich said, "Does it change why you refuse the raid?" "No." "Does it change what you need?" "No." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he picked up the harness again. "Then it's enough," he said. And that was the end of it. Calla did not say anything for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand on top of Drava's hand, the large green hand that was calloused from 3 weeks of difficult walking and still had a cut across the knuckles from the rope, and held it there for several seconds. She did not explain the gesture. She did not need to. Drava did not pull away. The days that followed had a texture that was difficult to describe and that she did not try to describe because she was not, by habit or by temperament, someone who spent time examining the interior architecture of her own experience. What she noticed instead were the external things. The way Bram said good morning to each of the farm animals individually, starting with the chickens and ending with the horse, and how Calla had begun standing near the kitchen window in the mornings to listen for it. The way Aldrich moved through the farm's routines, deliberate, precise, attending to each task fully before moving to the next, and how that quality of attention extended to the people in the house without being directed at them, the way good weather extends to everything beneath it without choosing to. She noticed that Aldrich visited a small fenced area behind the house every 2 or 3 evenings, 3 wooden crosses in an area ringed by flat stones. He stood before the smallest cross for different lengths of time on different visits. He never said anything she could hear. She stored this alongside the other things she was learning about the man who had dropped a rope into a pit without explanation and asked nothing in return. On the afternoon of the 10th day, she told Calla she was going to walk the property boundary and check the fence lines for damage. Calla said that was useful and went back to kneading the bread dough. Drava walked the boundary in a systematic pattern, starting at the northwest corner and moving clockwise, not because the fence lines were her primary interest, but because she had learned long ago that the best way to look for what you are actually looking for is to also genuinely look for something else. Real attention and performed attention have different qualities, and certain things only reveal themselves to the former. She found the first totem at the southwestern corner, attached to the twisted trunk of a low juniper that grew just inside the fence line. A small bundle, 3 animal vertebrae tied together with cord, a dark marking carved into the middle bone. She recognized it immediately, in the way you recognize something you have known all your life without ever being taught to name it. Stonefang. She stood still for a moment, then moved on. The second was at the southeastern corner. set into a split in a cedar fence post. Smaller than the first, more recently placed, the cord still had suppleness in it. The third was at the northern boundary, near the road, tucked into a pile of rocks with such apparent casualness that a person not looking for it would have walked past without a second thought. 3 totems, 3 directions. She stood with all 3 in her hand and looked at the farm from the northern boundary. The warm yellow light coming through the kitchen window, the silhouette of Bram visible through the glass as he moved around the kitchen table, probably conducting some important investigation of whatever Kala had left on the lower shelf. She understood what 3 directional totems meant. They meant the Stonefang shaman had been here, not Ugar's warriors. The shaman specifically, who traveled ahead of the war party, who read a place's defenses and reported back. 3 totems at 3 points meant the assessment was complete and the report had been made. Whatever came next would not be the shaman. She stood in the desert dark for a long time. She could leave tonight, pack what she had brought and take Bram before the morning and disappear further west. Buy more time, draw whatever was coming away from this farm and these 2 people who had done nothing to deserve having it arrive at their fence line. That was the rational calculation. The one that involved the fewest people being harmed by choices that were ultimately hers to carry. She looked at the kitchen window, at the shadow of Bram against the yellow light. She put the totems in her vest pocket and walked back toward the house. She would tell them in the morning. Tonight she needed to think, not about whether to tell them, that was already decided, but about how and what would need to happen after, and whether there was any configuration of the facts that made this less certain than it currently appeared. She already knew, by the time she reached the porch, that there was not. But she let herself have the night anyway. The sky above the desert was enormous and clear and full of stars, and Bram was asleep inside on a real bed for the 10th consecutive night, and somewhere in the kitchen, Kala had left a plate of bread and dried fruit on the table for whoever came in late, which was the kind of thing a person does when they have already quietly made a decision about someone without announcing it. Drava sat on the porch step and looked at the stars for a long time. She thought about Ugar's voice the day she had refused him. Not angry at first, almost quiet. The particular quiet of a man who cannot believe what he is hearing because he has never heard it before. She thought about the 3 days she had been given and the last night in the clan camp, and the way Bram had slept through all of it, unknowing, one hand curled under his chin, the way he always slept. She thought about what 3 totems at 3 directions meant, about how much time they likely had. She thought about a rope dropping into a pit in the early morning light, when the only reasonable expectation was that nothing good was coming. She stayed on the porch step until the cold moved in off the desert and the stars began their slow turn, and then she went inside quietly and checked on Bram once and lay down in the narrow bed in the back room and listened to the windmill turning in the dark, and did not sleep for a very long time. She told them in the morning, before the coffee was done. Aldrich was at the table. Kala was at the stove. Bram was still asleep in the back room, which was the specific reason Drava had chosen this hour. She wanted the conversation to be finished, and whatever it changed to have already settled before her son woke up and needed breakfast and brought the ordinary day in with him. She set the 3 totems on the table. Aldrich looked at them without touching them. Kala turned from the stove. Drava said what they were. She said where she had found them and what the placement at 3 separate directions signified. She said the shaman would have completed his survey at least 2 days ago, which meant the report to Ugar was already made, which meant the question was no longer whether something was coming, but how many days separated the present moment from it. She said, I should leave tonight or tomorrow at first light. I'll take Bram west through the canyon country. Whatever is coming will follow me and not reach this farm. The coffee finished. Kala poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat down. Aldrich looked at the totems for another moment. Then he looked at Drava. How many warriors does Ugar typically move with? 8, sometimes 12 if he considers the situation significant. And he'd consider this significant. Yes, Aldrich was quiet. He turned one of the totems over with one finger, not picking it up, just examining it from a different angle. You running west doesn't end anything. It just moves it. It moves it away from your farm. It moves it towards someone else's. He pushed the totem back to the center of the table. No, you stay. We figure out what we're dealing with and we deal with it. Drava looked at him. This is not your problem to carry. It was too late for that conversation on day 1, he said. I'm not interested in having it now on day 11. Calla wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. The absence of objection from a woman who did not suppress her objections when she had them. Drava sat with this for a moment. The rational part of her mind assembled the variables. The farm's defensibility, Aldrich's weapons, the distance to town, the shaman's likely timeline. And underneath that, something harder to organize, the awareness of what it meant that these two people were sitting at this table making this argument. She said, there is something I can do, a protection ritual, 4 corners of the property, specific materials, specific markings. It won't stop a war party with bone spears and axes, but it will affect the shaman's reading of this place, and the shaman is what affects Ugar's decisions. Calla asked, how? The shaman determines whether a place has spiritual protection, whether there are guardian presences that would make an attack costly in ways that go beyond the physical. If the marking reads as protected, the calculation changes. Does it actually work? Calla asked. In the way that most true things work, Drava said. Not always and not completely, and with results that are difficult to distinguish from coincidence if you are looking for an excuse not to believe it. But yes. Calla considered this with the focused stillness she applied to everything. Then she said, do it. Drava went to the barn and stayed there for the better part of an hour. She had the materials she needed because she had carried them with her since leaving the clan, not out of prescience, but out of the same instinct that had made her a useful scout for 11 years. You carry what you might need because the desert does not offer second chances to people who travel light on principle. The cord was leather, cured and cut to proper length. The bones were small, taken ethically from animals the clan had hunted. The crystals were pale green, from a river deposit in the high country near the clan's summer range, chosen for their mineral character rather than their appearance. She came out of the barn into the hard morning light and walked the perimeter. Northeast corner first, then southeast, then southwest, then northwest, always moving with the sun, always speaking the words her grandmother had spoken, who had learned them from her grandmother before her, a chain of women's knowledge passed down through a people who understood that the land has a memory and that memory can be addressed. She pressed each assembly into the earth with a firm movements, not deep, just enough. It was the intention that mattered, the focused quality of attention brought to the act. Calla stood on the porch and watched. When Drava finished and came back to the porch, Calla asked no more questions about it. She simply nodded in the way she nodded at things that had been done properly and went inside. The morning passed. Bram woke and ate and found the yard and spent 40 minutes in intense negotiation with a chicken that had apparently done something to offend him. The sun climbed, the shadows shortened, and then began to lengthen in the other direction. It was Drava who found the mark in the barn. She had gone in to check on the horse in the early afternoon. The animal had been restless since morning, shifting its weight and striking the floor with a dull, irregular rhythm that was not distress exactly, but not its normal settled patience either. She was running her hand along the horse's neck, speaking to it in the low guttural tones that worked on most animals regardless of language, when she saw the mark on the inside of the barn door. Small, precise, drawn in ash with a finger or a thin stick, at approximately the height of a man's knee, low enough to be invisible in ordinary light, visible now only because the angle of the afternoon sun came through the gap above the door and caught it directly. A Stonefang shaman's notation. Not a threat marker, an inventory mark, the kind left to record that a site had been assessed and what had been found. The top symbol indicated the presence of human occupants. The second indicated orc presence, female, non-warrior. The third she had to look at twice before she was certain she was reading it correctly. The mark was unfinished. The third symbol, which should have indicated the site's spiritual status, had been started and stopped. 3 strokes completed out of the 5 that the notation required. She crouched in the dim barn light and looked at those 3 strokes for a long time. The shaman had entered the barn. He had begun the notation and stopped. Something had interrupted him. Not physical danger. A shaman traveling advance of a war party was not deterred by that. It was not his function. Something else. Something he had encountered in this place that required him to return to Ugar with an incomplete report rather than a false one. She had set the protection, marking that same morning, hours after the shaman had already been and gone, and still he had stopped. Drava stood up slowly. She looked at the incomplete mark for another moment, then went to find Aldrich. He listened without interrupting. She showed him the section of barn door, both of them crouching so he could see the ash symbols at the right angle. He examined them carefully, the way he examined most things, thoroughly without performance. He was already inside, Aldrich said. Yes, before the ritual, before the totems were even removed. And he stopped anyway. Yes, Aldrich straightened up. He stood in the barn doorway, looking out at the yard, where Bram was now conducting some investigation of the well's crank mechanism with the serious, methodical focus of someone who intends to fully understand how a thing works before deciding what to do with that knowledge. Aldrich said, "So whatever stopped him was already here." Drava said nothing. He said, 2 days, you think? 2 days at the outside, possibly one. He nodded once. "I'm going to Ashrock." He rode out within the hour. Drava watched the dust settle behind the horse on the road north and then went back to the work of the day, because there was always work and because work was what you did when waiting was the only thing left. And waiting without movement was something she had never been able to do well. She and Kala worked in the kitchen through the late afternoon, and at some point the silence between them shifted into conversation. Not about Ugar or the shaman or what 2 days meant, but about other things. The bread dough and the temperature of the stone oven. A remedy for cracked hands that Kala's grandmother had made from rendered fat and dried herbs. The name of the lizard that Bram had adopted, which Bram had decided was Clyde, for reasons he had not explained and they had not pressed him on. It was the most ordinary afternoon Drava had spent in recent memory, and she was fully aware of it while it was happening, which was the closest she came to gratitude on any given day. Aldrich came back in the early evening with more powder and cartridges from the smithy and a set to his jaw that told her everything she needed to know about how the conversation with the marshal had gone before he said a word about it. He said, "Briggs will move when they cross the boundary, not before. And until then, it's our problem." He set the ammunition on the shelf inside the door, which it already was. They ate supper. Bram fell asleep at the table with his arms folded under his head, the way he always fell asleep when a day had been sufficiently interesting, and Kala lifted him without waking him and carried him to the back room with the ease of someone who had done that particular thing many times with a different child, in a different life, and had not forgotten how. Drava watched her go and said nothing. Later, after Kala had gone to bed and the farm was quiet, Drava went out to the porch. The desert night was absolute. No ambient light, no distant city glow, just stars in their staggering number, and the low wind moving through the scrub. She sat on the porch step and listened. Aldrich came out after a while and settled into the old rocking chair above and behind her without speaking. The silence lasted long enough to settle. Then she asked, "Your daughter, what was her name?" He was quiet for a moment. "Mara." It was the first time he had said it aloud in company. She could tell by the careful way he produced the word, the way a man pronounces something he uses rarely because it costs something each time. "How old?" 7. She was 7 years old. A pause. "Fever. 3 days start to finish. There's nothing you can do with a fever that moves that fast." Another pause. Longer. "I have replayed those 3 days more times than I can count, looking for the thing I should have done differently. I haven't found it yet. I don't think it's there to find." The wind moved through the yard. Drava said, "My people believe that the spirits of those who have died remain near the people they loved. Not to haunt, to watch over." Aldrich said nothing. "I have believed this since I was young," she said, "because my mother died when I was 12, and I continued to feel her presence in specific moments for years afterward. Not a sensation I can describe precisely. More like the awareness when someone who loves you is paying attention, even when you cannot see them." He still said nothing, but he had not retreated from the conversation, which was its own response. "I think there is something like that in this place," Drava said. "I noticed it early, in the way you acted when you found us, in the way Kala is with Bram." She paused. I don't think it is nothing. I think it is the gravity of something that was here and is still here in a different form. Well, the rocking chair was still. After a long time, Aldrich said, "Thank you." Not for anything specific, she understood this. She did not specify either. They stayed on the porch until the cold moved in, and then went inside, and the farm was quiet again under the enormous turning sky. The 13th day came in the color of rust. Drava was awake before first light. She lay still for a moment in the thin gray dark of the back room and listened. The horse. Not the restless shifting of the past 2 days. Something different. A tension in the animal's stillness that she recognized the way you recognize a held breath. She was up before the thought was fully formed. She dressed in the dark. She moved through the house without sound and opened the back door and went out into the yard. The sky was the color of cooling iron in the east. The air smelled of dust and the electric absence that precedes something without announcing what that something is. She went to the barn first. The horse was motionless in the stall, nostrils wide, head turned toward the southern fence line. She put her hand flat against the animal's neck and felt the tension there. Not the surface trembling of cold, but the deep muscular held-in stillness of a creature that has scented a predator and is calculating its options. She went back out of the barn and looked south, nothing visible yet. But the desert at distance had a way of hiding things in plain sight. A group of figures at a quarter-mile in early morning light, moving steadily, would look like heat shimmer or shadow until they were considerably closer. She went inside and woke Aldrich with one hand on his shoulder. He came awake immediately and completely. He looked at her face and did not ask any questions. He reached for the rifle. Calla was already awake. She appeared in the bedroom doorway while Aldrich was pulling on his boots, and she looked at Drava, and Drava gave her a single nod. Calla's expression did not change. She went to the corner of the room where the old shotgun leaned and checked the load with deliberate, quiet movements of someone who has decided what they are going to do and is now only managing the logistics. Drava went back outside. They came out of the desert haze as the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline, and the low light caught them in a way that turned them briefly into a freeze. 8 silhouettes against the rust-colored sky, broad and tall, and moving with the ground-covering pace of warriors who have covered long distances on foot and have not become tired from it. Ugar was in front, larger than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply stopped measuring him against the scale of the clan and was now measuring him against the scale of the farm and the gate and the yard, where everything was sized for humans. He had his bone spear across his back, 2 axes at his waist. The tattoos that covered both arms extended to his neck in patterns she had watched being applied when she was a child by the same shaman who now walked 2 paces behind his left shoulder. They stopped 15 paces from the gate. Drava was already in the yard. She had not taken the axe she had seen leaning against the side of the house. She had seen it and chosen not to take it, a decision that was not about incapacity, but about the message conveyed by an unarmed person who does not appear afraid. She heard the door behind her and heard Aldrich's boots on the porch steps and did not look back. Ugar looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the flat, assessing patience of a man who has decided very little in his life surprises him and who considers this a point of pride. He said her name, her full name, in the clan's tongue, the birth name and the earned name together, the way you address someone whose history you intend to reference. She answered in the human tongue deliberately. Ugar. The clan no longer holds you in breach, he said. He had learned enough of the human language for practical use, the way all Stonefang who operated near the boundary did. His accent was thicker than hers, but the words were accurate. Return with the boy. This ends here. I'm not returning. His eyes moved past her to the farm, to Aldrich standing on the porch, to the house and the barn, and the 4 corners where, if he looked, and he would look, the ground had been recently disturbed in specific small ways. He looked back at her. The human holds you here. No one holds me anywhere, she said. I stay because I choose to stay. Something moved across his face. Not anger. She had expected anger and had prepared for it. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has just been told something he finds genuinely incomprehensible and is deciding whether incomprehension is the same thing as being wrong. He said, then the human dies first. He raised one hand. The warriors behind him moved. Not charging, not yet. The coordinated advance of a disciplined unit moving to close distance before the engagement begins. Drava held her ground. Behind her, she heard Aldrich descend the porch steps. What she had not accounted for fully by him, or had accounted for and set aside because the accounting made the calculation too terrible, was the single warrior who did not advance with the others, who moved laterally instead to the right, skirting the fence line with quick, low steps, and came around the eastern corner of the yard. She heard the sound before she could respond to it. A grunt of controlled surprise from Aldrich, then the silence that follows when a man has something pressed to his throat and understands that speaking loudly is no longer an option. She turned. The warrior had come in from the blind side. He had Aldrich from behind, one massive arm across his chest, the other at his jaw. Aldrich had the rifle but could not raise it. His eyes found Drava's across the yard. She looked at Ugar. He was watching her with something that was almost curiosity. The expression of a man running an experiment he had already decided the outcome of, waiting to see if he was right. She looked at Aldrich. At the stillness in his face, not panic, not the animal bright fear of a man who has never been in physical danger, but the contained, calculating stillness of someone assessing his own situation and trusting the people around him to continue assessing theirs. She dropped her eyes to the ground. She breathed twice. The calculation was producing one answer, and she did not like the answer, but she was not someone who rejected answers on the basis of preference. She had started to step forward, had already shifted her weight, already opened her mouth to say the words that would offer the trade Ugar wanted, when the door of the farmhouse opened. Kala came through it. She came through the door with the shotgun leveled at a height and angle that required no interpretation. Her face was the same face it always was, measuring, deliberate, absent of performance. Her hands were steady in the way that hands are steady when the person holding a thing has already made their decision and is now only executing it. She said to the warrior holding Aldrich, clearly and without raising her voice, "Let go of him." The yard went absolutely still. Ugar did not move. The warrior did not move. The advance of the other 7 had stopped at the moment Kala came through the door. Not out of deference, but out of the tactical reflex that pauses when a new element enters a situation and its implications have not yet been assessed. And then from inside the house came the sound of small feet on wooden floorboards, and the door that Kala had not quite latched swung open again, and Bram came through it. He had been asleep. His eyes were still heavy with it. He had heard something and woken and followed the sound in the way that 4-year-olds follow sounds, without preamble, without assessment, in the complete trust that the world they move through will continue to make sense. He came to the edge of the porch, saw his mother in the yard, and called to her. One word in the clan's tongue, the word that was her name in his mouth and no one else's. The yard absorbed the sound of it. Ugar's eyes moved to the boy. Bram looked back at him with the wide-eyed, open curiosity of a child who does not yet know what a war leader is and therefore does not register him as one, only as a very large person standing in the yard on an otherwise ordinary morning. The shaman moved. 2 steps to Ugar's shoulder, a low voice close to the war leader's ear, the quick, precise intonation of someone who is not persuading, but informing. Ugar's eyes moved from Bram to the 4 corners of the property, unhurried, one at a time. Northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest. The small disturbances in the earth where the assemblies had been pressed in 2 days before. He looked at each corner in turn. His expression did not change in any way she would have predicted. He looked at Drava last. He said, in the clan's tongue, which meant it was for her, not for the humans. The shaman could not complete his mark. No, she said also in the clan's tongue. He was quiet for a long moment. The warrior still had Aldrich. Kala still had the shotgun level. Bram was still on the porch, having located Clyde the lizard on the post beside him and redirected his full attention to it, which was precisely the kind of merciful indifference to the situation only a 4-year-old could produce without effort. Ugar said, "This place holds protection." "Yes," he said, "it held protection before you marked it." She did not answer because she did not have an answer for it and because she understood that he was not asking her for one. He was stating a fact he had not expected to encounter, and he was doing what she had always known him capable of, beneath the decades of war leadership and the certainty of his own authority. He was adjusting to the fact. He looked at her for the last time with the expression of a man who has understood something he will not speak of directly. He raised his hand. The warrior released Aldrich. You chose the path of the weak, Ugar said, back in the human tongue now for reasons she would consider later. May weakness protect you. He turned. The warriors turned with him, the shaman last, and they walked back into the desert haze that had produced them, becoming silhouettes and then shapes and then nothing. Just the flat, red, enormous land receiving them back into itself without comment. Drava stood in the yard and did not move until she was certain they were gone. She wanted to see the last impression of their tracks with her own eyes before she allowed herself to accept what had happened. When she was certain, she let herself exhale. Aldrich was a few feet behind her. She heard him set the rifle down against the fence post, a small sound in the absolute quiet, and then the slight unevenness in his breath that was the only indication he would give of what the last several minutes had required of him. Calla lowered the shotgun slowly. She stood for a moment on the porch, eyes on the horizon, then turned and went inside to find Bram, who had abandoned Clyde in favor of a more pressing structural investigation of the porch railing. Drava stood in the yard. She looked at the place where Ugar had stood. She looked at the southern desert and the nothing it offered her now. She thought about the shaman's unfinished mark on the barn door. She thought about what Ugar had said. Not the public words, in the human tongue, but the ones before them, in the clan's language, that he had not needed to say. It held protection before you marked it. She thought about a man who had come back with a rope when he could have kept walking. About a woman who had placed her hand over a stranger's without explanation and held it there. About a 4-year-old boy who had walked onto a porch full of Stonefang warriors and looked for the lizard. She thought about these things for a long time, standing in the yard in the early morning light. Then she walked to where the axe was leaning against the side of the house, crouched down, and set it carefully in the dirt. Blade down, handle resting against the wall, the way you set down a thing you have been carrying that you are now ready to put somewhere it can rest. She covered her face with both hands, not from grief, not from relief. From the weight of a moment you have survived that you were not certain you would survive, and from the difficulty of being someone who has held everything together for a very long time and must now, in the privacy of 2 hands pressed over a face, acknowledge that the holding was hard. The sun moved, the desert settled back into its long, ordinary heat. Somewhere on the other side of the house, Bram had found something that required commentary, and she could hear his voice, bright and specific and entirely unconcerned with the morning, explaining it at length to Calla. Drava lifted her face from her hands. She looked at the horizon one more time. Then she stood up and went to find her son. The farm was quiet in a different way after that. Not the quiet Aldrich had described once, obliquely, the empty quiet that had settled into the house after Mara died and had not lifted in 4 years. That quiet had been the absence of something. What settled over the farm in the days following the morning of the 13th was fuller than that. It was the quiet of things that have been said without words and need time to be absorbed. The quiet of people who have stood together in a yard in the early morning light and learned something about each other that cannot be unlearned and are now living inside that knowledge, finding its shape. Drava did not speak much for 2 days. She worked. She woke before first light and moved through the farm's routines with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything since arriving. The field edges, the water trough, the fence posts that still needed reinforcement on the eastern side. She ate what was put on the table and thanked Calla for it, and took Bram to bed when the evening came, and lay in the dark of the back room listening to his breathing settle into sleep. But she was turned inward, and she knew it, and she did not try to disguise it from the 2 people who had earned the right to notice. She was working through the arithmetic of what had happened. Not the physical facts, those were simple, already organized and stored. What required the time and the silence was something harder to name. The understanding that Ugar had stood in this yard and turned his back. That 11 years of belonging to a people, 11 years of clan law and clan code, and the particular architecture of loyalty that holds a nomadic war society together. All of it had ended with a man she had known since she was a girl looking at the 4 corners of a farm and saying words she had not expected him to say. It held protection before you marked it. She had thought about those words every morning since. She thought about them again now, On the second afternoon, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Bram try to feed a piece of bread to Clyde, who accepted the offering with the imperious patience of a creature that has already decided it will be provided for and is now simply waiting out the mechanics of the provision. The lizard had not left. This struck her as worth noting. Calla came up beside her and looked out at Bram in the yard. They stood like that for a moment without speaking, and then Calla said, "I was going to make bread this afternoon, if you wanted to help." It was phrased as an offer, not as a remedy or a prescription or an attempt to draw her out. Just bread and the invitation to stand in a kitchen and make it. And Drava understood that this was how Calla expressed most of what she felt. Not directly, but through the offering of a specific ordinary task that could be done alongside another person. She said yes. The kitchen held the afternoon heat in the way of adobe-walled rooms, not the sharp, assaulting heat of the open desert, but something slower, stored, like warmth that had been thinking about itself for several hours. Calla set the flour on the board and showed Drava the ratio without measuring it, by feel, the way her grandmother had taught her. A mound this height, a hollow in the center, water added slowly until the dough came together with a resistance you learned to recognize in your hands before you could describe it in words. Drava had made bread before, in the clan's manner, unleavened, flat, cooked directly on hot stone. This was different in its method and its patience. The dough needed to be worked for longer than she expected, needed time to change under the hands, needed something that was not quite effort and not quite gentleness, but the sustained middle ground between the two. She worked it and felt it change. Calla talked occasionally about small things. The neighbor 2 ridges east, whose well had gone dry 2 summers ago, and who had taken to riding past the farm more often than could be explained by his route to town. The wild sage along the north fence line that she dried in the fall. The fact that Bram, in her estimation, was going to be extremely good at building things, based on his ongoing structural analysis of every fixed object on the farm. Drava listened and responded in small ways, and felt the interior arithmetic slow its turning. At one point, Calla said, not looking up from the dough, "You should know that what you did in the yard, standing out there without a weapon, that was not a small thing." Drava said, "It was a calculation." "I know," Calla said. "That's what I mean." They worked in silence for a while after that. The bread came out right. Calla tapped the bottom of the finished loaf, a hollow sound, slightly resonant, and demonstrated what to listen for, and Drava listened and found it in the second loaf, and felt something in her chest that was very small and very clean, and that she recognized after a moment as pride. The straightforward, uncomplicated kind. The kind that does not need an audience. She had not felt that particular feeling in some time. Aldrich came in from the field in the late afternoon, set his hat on the hook by the door, looked at the 2 loaves cooling on the rack, and said nothing. But the look he gave Drava communicated something she did not try to translate into words. Some things were better left in the register they arrived in. That evening, Bram ate 2 portions and fell asleep at the table for the second time in 2 weeks, which had apparently become his preferred method of indicating that the day had been satisfactory. Calla carried him to the back room. Aldrich stoked the stove. The desert wind came in at the window in the small, friendly way it sometimes did. Not the dry battering of the afternoon wind, but the cooler evening movement that carried with it the smell of sage and distance. Drava sat at the table and felt, for the first time since the 13th day, that she was fully in the present moment rather than circling above it. She heard Aldrich go out the back door. She waited a few minutes, then followed. She had not gone to the small cemetery before. She had seen it, had noted its location and its 3 wooden crosses in the way that she noted most things. Catalogued, set aside. But she had understood, without being told, that it was not a place she should arrive at casually. She went around the side of the house and stopped at the edge of the ring of flat stones. Aldrich was standing before the smallest cross. He did not hear her come up, or perhaps he heard her and said nothing. She stood at the boundary of the stones and looked at the cross, simple, squared, the wood still relatively pale, not yet fully weathered, a name carved in the horizontal piece. He said without turning, "I talk to her sometimes. I know how it sounds." "It sounds right," Drava said. He was quiet for a moment. "I told her about Bram, last week before everything happened. I told her there was a boy on the farm who laughed at beetles and had adopted a lizard and said good mourning to everyone individually every single day without fail. I told her I thought she would have liked him. The evening sky above the canyon ridges had gone the color of old copper, fading at the edges towards something cooler and darker. Drava said, "My people believe that the ones we've lost are given exactly as much knowledge of our lives as they need to not worry about us. No more, no less." She paused. "I don't know if that's true. I believe it anyway." "That's a good way to believe something," and he said. They stood for a while in the evening light, in the way that people stand beside each other at the edge of something that belongs to someone else, present, respectful of the distance, but present. On the way back to the house, Aldrich said, "It's been easier since you and Bram came. I know that's a strange thing to say given everything that's happened." Drava said, "It's not strange. The house was very quiet before." "I know." He held the back door for her. She went inside. The kitchen still smelled of the bread, and Calla had left a candle burning on the table, and from the back room came the sound of Bram and the deep sleep of children who have spent the day being completely themselves. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that no one had planned and no one remarked upon, which was how the best rhythms established themselves. Drava and Aldrich worked the field in the mornings. The wheat was in the long, slow part of its growth where the work was maintenance rather than intervention, checking the irrigation channels, keeping the weeds from the edges, watching the sky for signs of coming weather. They worked in the easy parallel silence that had developed between them early and deepened with time, occasionally exchanging observations, a section of ground drier than it should be, a wind shift that suggested change in 2 days. And these exchanges had the character of a language built from the ground up, specific to the geography they were both learning. Calla was teaching Bram to read. She drew the letters on the kitchen table with her finger first, then in flour, then on the slate board she had brought down from the shelf where it had been sitting unused for a long time. Bram approached each letter with the grave, total concentration of a child who does not yet know that some things are supposed to be difficult, which is the most effective possible approach to learning. He retained everything on the first attempt. He repeated the letters to Clyde in the evenings on the porch, which Calla said was excellent practice, and which Drava suspected Clyde found edifying. Drava watched all of it with an attention she did not try to disguise. She watched Calla's patience with the boy, not performed, not effortful, just present in the same way that certain people are present, fully and without reservation in the company of a child who is learning something. She watched Aldrich crouch down one afternoon to examine something Bram had found under the stone by the well. A beetle, enormous and black, and apparently of great personal significance, and laugh. A short, spontaneous sound that surprised them both. The kind of laugh that happens before the self-consciousness that would have prevented it can arrive. She stored these things alongside the others, the growing record of what this place was. She went back to the protection markings 3 weeks after setting them and found them intact. The corner assemblies undisturbed, the crystals unchanged, the cords still properly bound. She pressed her hand against the ground at the northeast corner and felt what she always felt in this particular spot, a density, a gathered quality, as though something was paying attention here in the focused way of something that takes its obligations seriously. It held protection before you marked it. She sat back on her heels and looked at the farm from the northeast corner. The house, the barn, the windmill turning slowly, the yellow light already beginning in the kitchen window where Calla would be starting the evening meal. She had been here for 6 weeks, the longest she had stayed anywhere since leaving the clan. She stayed at the corner of the farm in the red afternoon light and let herself feel the full weight of that fact without rushing past it toward the next calculation. Marshall Briggs came on a Tuesday. She knew it was Tuesday because Calla baked on Tuesdays and the kitchen smelled of it. And she had come to use the smell as a temporal marker the way she used to use the position of the sun over specific canyon features to know what time it was. She was in the field when she heard the horse on the road. She straightened and looked north. A single rider moving at a moderate pace, not hurried, which was the first thing she assessed, because hurried single riders typically carried one kind of news, and unhurried single riders could carry several kinds. The horse was gray. When it came through the gate, she recognized the lean silhouette and the gray mustache visible under the hat brim. Marshall Briggs. He had come once before, about 3 weeks after the 13th day, on a different kind of errand. the community kind, driven by complaint rather than law, which had been the distinction Aldrich had made clear to him at the gate. Briggs had looked at the farm, at Drava in the field, at Bram in the yard, at Calla on the porch, and he had said nothing irregular here, and he had turned his horse. This time he came differently. He stopped at the gate and took his hat off before anyone had come to meet him, which was not how he had conducted himself on the previous visit. Drava set down the hoe and walked in from the field. Aldrich came from the barn. Calla appeared on the porch. Bram was somewhere in the yard with Clyde, and a leaf he had decided was interesting. Briggs looked at all of them, then looked at the ground for a moment. Then he put his hat back on and said, "I have some news. It's not good news." He said it plainly, the way men of his type preferred to deliver difficult information, directly without the framing that extends the duration of uncertainty and compounds its weight. 5 days ago, a trading party coming through the Green Shadow Canyon had found the Stone Fang encampment, or rather, what remained of it. The camp had been attacked. The attack had not been recent. 4 days, the trading party estimated, based on what they found. Ugar and most of the Stone Fang warriors were dead. He paused there, not for effect, but to give the information room. Drava stood in the yard and did not move. Briggs said the attackers had left specific markings at the camp, carved totems, different in style from the Stone Fang zone, larger, more elaborate. The trading party had not recognized the clan. Briggs had taken the description and gone looking for someone who would. He had found a trader in Ashrock who had come through from the Western Territory 3 months ago and had enough experience of the desert clans to identify the markings. Black Moon Clan. He looked at Drava when he said it, not with accusation, with the focused, direct attention of a man who understands that information needs to go to the person who can do the most with it. They were moving west when the trading party last had any indication of their position, Briggs said. Toward the Valley Farms. I've sent word to the settlements east of the ridge, but I need to know what you know about them. Anything you can tell me about how they move, where they camp, what their approach looks like before it becomes obvious. The yard was quiet. Bram had appeared from somewhere and was standing near the porch steps with Clyde on his arm, watching the adult conversation with the attentive expression of a child who does not understand the content, but understands the register. Drava looked at Briggs. She looked at Aldrich, standing slightly to her left and slightly behind, in the same position he had assumed on the morning of the 13th, present, ready, not in front of her. She looked at Calla on the porch. She said to Briggs, "Come inside." She told him what she knew. She knew the Black Moon Clan's movement patterns because the Stone Fang had tracked them for a decade. They were the clan that occupied the territory to the north and west, and knowing your neighbor's movements was how you survived as a nomadic people in contested desert country. She knew they traveled faster than the Stone Fang because they did not bring civilians on war movements. They were a warrior-forward structure, which made their raids more mobile and less predictable than Ugar's had been. She knew their approach signatures, the markers they left at water sources and canyon passes, different from the Stone Fangs, but following the same underlying logic of territorial communication. She told Briggs all of this in organized, measured terms, the way she would have briefed a clan war council, information in its proper order, assessments separated from speculation, the things she knew clearly distinguished from the things she inferred. Briggs listened without interrupting. He had a small notebook, and he wrote in it steadily. When she finished, he closed the notebook. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a pragmatic person who has just received better information than they expected from a source they had not known to expect it from. He said, "Is there anyone who could approach the surviving Stone Fang? Whatever's left of them. They'd have more reason than anyone to move against the Black Moon Clan right now, and they'd know the terrain." Drava said, "There were 2 smaller Stone Fang camps I knew of in the high country north of the canyon. Ugar kept them as waypoints, not war camps. Women, elders, younger warriors not yet at full standing. They would not have been at the main camp when it was hit. Could they be reached? By someone they would receive? Yes." He looked at her steadily. "And would they receive you?" The kitchen was quiet. The bread smell had persisted through the afternoon. Outside, the yard held the ordinary sounds of the farm's evening, the chickens settling, the windmill turning. Bram's voice talking to Clyde in the tone he used for extended informational briefings. Drava said, I left the Stone Fang under Ugar's order. Ugar is dead. The order dies with the man who issued it. Whether they receive me depends on who is leading those camps now and what their current situation requires. She paused. They are in a situation that requires a great deal. I think they would receive me. Briggs nodded slowly. He looked at Aldrich, then back at Drava. This is not something I can order. I want to be clear about that. It's dangerous, the route is dangerous, and whatever happens in those camps is beyond the reach of anything I can provide in terms of support. I understand that, Drava said. He put his hat on and stood from the table. He shook Aldrich's hand and nodded to Calla and said at the door, to no one in particular, and therefore to all of them, I'll be at the Ashrock office. If you need anything that I can provide, that's where I'll be. He rode out. They watched the dust settle behind him on the road north. The evening meal was quiet. Bram ate with methodical focus. Calla served without speaking much. Aldrich moved through the meal at his usual pace, but his eyes moved occasionally to the window and back, and Drava knew he was doing what she was doing, running the numbers, assessing the shape of what had just been laid on the table. After Bram was in bed, Drava sat down with Aldrich and Calla. She said, I want to tell you what I'm thinking. They listened. She said the Black Moon Clan's movement west was not arrayed in the way Ugar's proposed attack had been arrayed. Opportunistic, resource-driven, limited in scope. What Briggs had described was the elimination of the Stone Fang's main war camp. That was not resource gathering. That was territorial consolidation. A clan doing territorial consolidation does not stop at the first obstacle it removes. It continues until it has secured the territory it has decided to claim. The farms in the valley were in that territory. The Stone Fang remnants in the high country, if she could reach them, if they were in the condition she believed them to be in, if the leadership that remained was willing to act rather than scatter, represented the only organized force in this part of the desert with both the motivation and the knowledge of the land to slow what was coming. She could reach those camps. She knew the routes. She knew the approach protocols. She knew enough of the current Stone Fang internal structure to make an argument that would be heard rather than dismissed. She could not do it from this farm. Calla's hands were flat on the table. Aldrich's face was doing the thing it did when he was absorbing a large amount of information and waiting until he was sure he had absorbed all of it before responding to any part. Drava said, Bram stays here. I need to know he is safe while I'm moving, and he is safe here. She looked at Calla. I am asking you something very large. Calla said, you're not asking. You're telling us what you need, which is different. She paused, hands still flat on the table. Yes. Drava looked at Aldrich. He said, I'm coming with you. She had expected this. She had also prepared specific points to argue against it. His farm, his wife, the practical difficulties of a human and Stone Fang negotiations. She looked at his face and understood that the argument would be technically sound and completely without effect. And that there were moments when the understanding when not to spend your energy was itself a form of intelligence. She said, you understand that whatever happens in those camps, I cannot guarantee your safety. I'm aware. The Stone Fang remnants may not extend trust to a human. You'll manage that. Aldrich. Drava. He said it with exactly the same weight she had said his. I dropped a rope into a pit. Whatever this is, I was in it from that morning. Don't try to pull me out of it now. The candle burned at the center of the table. The desert wind moved at the window. Somewhere in the back room, Bram turned over in deep sleep, resettling, finding the position that would carry him through until morning. Calla stood and put the kettle on. She brought 3 cups and sat back down, and none of them spoke for a while, just sat with the weight of the decision and let it find its proper place. Drava thought about the canyon routes north, the water sources at 2-day intervals, the Stone Fang waypoint camp she had visited 11 years ago as a young scout, before she had earned her secondary name, when the world had seemed very large and her knowledge of it very small. She thought about what she would say when she arrived, and to whom, and what she would need them to understand before she could say the rest. She thought about Bram asleep in the back room, the sound of him saying good morning to Clyde in the early light, the tone of complete, unself-conscious engagement with a small lizard on a fence post, as though the lizard's morning were as significant as any morning, which Bram had clearly decided it was. She thought, this is what you protect when you protect something. Not an abstraction. This, the specific sound of a child greeting a lizard, the smell of bread on a Tuesday, a rope coming down in the early morning when you are at the bottom of a pit and have stopped expecting anything good. Calla said quietly, looking into her cup, come back. It was not a request. It was the most compressed form of a much larger thing, offered in the economy of a woman who understood that some things, said too fully, become too heavy to carry. Drova said, yes. She went to check on Bram before going to bed. She stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at him in the dark. The green face relaxed in sleep, one hand curled under his chin. The blanket kicked half off already. She went in and pulled the blanket back up. He didn't wake. She crouched beside the narrow bed and stayed there for a long time, committing the current version of his face to the part of her memory she kept most carefully. She said nothing. Some things existed in the territory beyond words and were better served by the quality of attention brought to them than by any attempt at translation. She stood up and went back to bed. She lay in the dark and did not sleep for a while. She listened to the windmill. She listened to the desert. She listened to the sound this particular house made at this particular hour. The breathing of it, the mix of sounds that a place makes when it is inhabited and at rest, sounds that she had not known to listen for 6 weeks ago and now could not imagine not hearing. She thought about what Ugar had said at the end, the words in the human tongue chosen so she would understand. May weakness protect you. She had thought about those words many times and understood them differently each time. Tonight she understood them as something close to a blessing. Not gracious, not warm, but genuine. The acknowledgement of a man who had spent his life organizing the world by strength and had, in one morning in one yard, encountered something that did not fit that organization and had chosen to name it rather than destroy it. Weakness that protects has another name. She said it quietly to the dark of the back room. Family. Morning came the way mornings came in the desert. Not gradually, but with sudden decision. The sun cleared the eastern ridge and the world went from dark to lit in the space of minutes. The red earth of the yard catching it and holding it, warm and absolute. Drava was in the yard when Bram came out. He came through the door with his hair committed entirely to a direction that had nothing to do with intention, and he looked around the yard with the bright, practical eyes of a child assessing what the morning had to offer. He found Clyde on the fence post, in the same location Clyde occupied every morning, with the reliability of a lizard that has found a post that suits its requirements and sees no reason to revise that decision. Bram said, "Good morning, Clyde." He looked at Drava. "Good morning, Mama." He looked at the chickens. "Good morning." He looked at the sky, briefly, something he had added to the rotation 2 weeks ago without explanation. "Good morning." He looked at the horse visible through the barn door. "Good morning." Drava crouched down and opened her arms. He walked into them in the way he always did, completely, without reservation, with the full physical confidence of a child who has never had cause to doubt that the arms would be there. She held him for a long moment and felt his small hands grip the back of her vest. She said something very quietly, close to his ear, in the clan's tongue, the words her grandmother had used as a parting when someone was leaving for uncertain country. Not goodbye. The clan's tongue had no direct equivalent for goodbye, which had always struck her as an accurate instinct. Instead, I carry you with me, which was not a metaphor but a precise description of a practice, the keeping of a person in a specific part of awareness, carried consciously, the way a scout checks a water supply, making sure it is still there and still good. Bram said into her shoulder, "When are you coming back?" "Before you run out of things to tell Clyde," she said. He considered this with appropriate seriousness. "That's a long time," he said. "I have a lot of things." "I know," she said. "It's very reassuring." She stood up. He stayed close to her side as she finished the last of the preparation, checking the saddlebag, the provisions, the water. Aldrich had the horses ready. His gear was already packed with the efficiency of a man who does not over-equip himself, but does not leave out anything that could matter. Calla stood at the gate. She had Bram's hand when Drava came over to her, and she held it with the easy, habitual grip of someone who has been holding a child's hand long enough that the child has stopped noticing it as a specific thing and experiences it simply as the way of having a hand. She looked at Drava with her full, measuring attention. The look Drava had learned to read as the visible portion of something much larger working underneath. She said, "I'll keep him talking so he doesn't run after you." "Bah," Drava said, "thank you." Kala took her hand briefly, the same gesture as the first time, unhurried, complete, requiring nothing in return. The thing itself offered and received. Drava went to the horses. Aldrich was mounted, the gray morning light catching the white threaded through his dark hair. His hat settled the way it settled when he had made a decision and was done reconsidering it. He looked at her with the steady, practical regard she had first encountered at the bottom of a pit and had been reading correctly ever since. She mounted. She adjusted in the saddle and looked at the farm one full time. The house, the barn, the windmill already turning in the early wind, the garden beds, the fence with its still imperfect eastern section, the well where Bram had first shown her the beetle, the porch where she had sat on the step and looked at stars and let herself feel what it meant to have reached somewhere. She looked at Bram, standing at the gate with Kala's hand in his. He was looking at her with the same expression he brought to most things. Open, attentive, entirely present. He raised his free hand, she raised hers. She turned the horse south and then west, toward the canyon country and the high routes that would take them north. And Aldrich came alongside Iran, and they moved out through the gate and onto the red earth road, and the farm fell behind them the way that places fall behind when you are moving through open country. Slowly at first, the familiar shapes holding their size against the distance, and then smaller, and then held only at the edge of vision. The way of something you are choosing not to watch diminish. She did not look back. She had already seen everything she needed to see. The desert opened ahead of them, enormous and exact. The canyon ridges in the west were still in shadow, the far peaks catching the first full light of the morning in a way that made them look briefly unresolved, like something deciding what it was going to be. The road was dry and the horses moved well on it, settling into the ground-covering rhythm of animals that have been properly rested and are willing to work. After a while, Aldrich said, "North, you said, then through the canyon. The eastern slot narrows at the top but opens into the high plateau. The waypoint camp is 3 days from the entrance, if we move steadily." He nodded. They rode. The sun climbed and the shadows shortened and the desert asserted its full character. The heat, the light, the vast and indifferent beauty of a land that has no opinion about what crosses it and asks only that you bring enough water. Drava knew this country the way she knew most things she had learned by moving through them, not as names and maps, but as knowledge stored in the body as much as in the mind. The direction of certain winds, the color of rock at elevations where water collected, the animal tracks that indicated a reliable source within half a day's walk. She would need all of it. She thought as she rode about the Stonefang survivors in the high camps, about what she would find and what she would need to say. She thought about the Black Moon Clan and what Briggs had described and what the shape of that movement implied about timeline. She thought about the valley farms and the people in them who did not yet know what was moving toward them from the northwest. She thought about all of this in the organized, forward-looking way she thought about problems that were still ahead of her, that had not yet arrived in their full shape, and therefore still had the quality of the configurable. And in a separate part of her mind, the part she kept most carefully, the part that had been added to over 6 weeks in ways she had not anticipated when she chose a farm from the edge of a market crowd in Ashrock and spent 3 days watching it from the scrub line, she carried what she was carrying. Bram's hand in hers in the early morning, the weight of him asleep against her side. "Good morning, Clyde." "Good morning." "Good morning." Kala's hand over hers, the bread on a Tuesday. The sound of a house that has stopped being empty. Aldrich dropping a rope into a pit at first light, not because he had a reason that could be fully explained, but because there was a child at the bottom, and that was reason enough. She had not known when she chose this farm, when she had stood in the scrub line in the dark and watched the lamp in the kitchen window and decided this was the place. She had not known what she was choosing. She had made a calculation. The calculation had been correct in the way she had predicted, and entirely wrong about the ways that turned out to matter most. That was, she had come to understand how the most important things worked. You brought your best assessment to the available information and you made your choice. And the choice, if it was the right one, took you somewhere the assessment had not been able to see. She had been in a pit. A rope had come down. The rest of it had followed from that, in the way that everything follows from the first true thing, step by necessary step, out into the open. The canyon entrance appeared ahead of them in the mid-morning light, the red walls rising on either side of the slot passage, narrowing the sky to a corridor of blue above. Drava looked at it and felt the settling that came before moving into difficult country. Not calm exactly, but the focused, forward-facing quality of a person who knows what they are doing and why, and carries both of those things with equal steadiness. She rode in. Aldrich rode beside her. Behind them on a farm in the high desert country, Calla watched the gate until the road was empty and the dust was gone. Then she looked down at Bram, who had been watching the empty bend with the patient, certain expression of someone who has been given a promise and intends to hold it in trust until it is redeemed. She said, "Breakfast." He considered the horizon one more moment. Then he turned and took her hand, and they went inside. She made eggs the way he liked them, and he ate it with focus and then went to find Clyde and conduct the morning's greetings. And Calla stood at the kitchen window and watched him move across the yard. The green of him bright in the morning sun, the pointed ears catching the light, the serious and complete attention he brought to the lizard on the fence post. And she felt the house around her, which had been quiet for 4 years in the way of a place that has forgotten how to be full, and understood that it was not quiet anymore. It would not be quiet again. Some families are made from blood. Some are made from a rope dropped into a pit, from a hand placed over a hand without explanation, from a child who says good morning to everything that holds still long enough to hear it. Drava would come back. Calla knew this the way she knew most true things, not from evidence, but from the grammar of everything that had led to this morning, and from the nature of a woman who had walked out of a clan with nothing and a 4-year-old boy, and had chosen at every turn since the thing that kept people alive rather than the thing that was easier. She turned from the window. There was bread to make. It was Tuesday. The windmill turned. The wheat moved in the light wind along the southern field. The gate stood open at the road, and the road ran south and west into the enormous, patient, indifferent, beautiful desert, and 2 riders moved through it, small against the scale of the land, steady, heading towards something that was not yet determined and could not be, and carrying with them, each in their own way, the full weight of what they were riding toward it for, which was enough, which had always been enough.